In 2025, investigators revealed what happened during the Titan submersible's final moments, and it was worse than most people imagined. For the first time, we learned the crew spent their last minutes desperately trying to save themselves. It was a futile attempt. Moments later, immense pressure crushed through the hull, destroying the sub and everyone inside. It was a catastrophe years in the making, and 5 people paid the price. But the evidence suggests the most terrifying part of the OceanGate disaster may have happened before the implosion. So, how did 5 people end up trusting this submersible in the first place? It's hard enough to get a company to get people to give them money for an unproven product. Imagine how much harder it would be to get them to put their lives in the company's hands. But that's exactly what Stockton Rush accomplished. The CEO of OceanGate wasn't just running the company, he was the company. After co-founding OceanGate in 2009 with Argentine businessman Guillermo Sonline, who exited in 2013, Rush became the driving force behind everything the company did. His relentless hustle and larger-than-life personality convinced investors and customers to buy into his vision, and that would spell disaster for him and everybody else. Rush was always fixated on going deeper than ever before. His early vehicles, Antipodes and Cyclops 1, were small experimental subs that carried only a handful of people and reached shallower depths. The third vessel, Titan, debuted in 2018, and it was the first privately owned model that could reach 13,000 feet under the water. But the goal was to keep pushing. Plans were drawn up for successive models that could reach 20,000 feet. And that drew attention. If there was one person you would expect to be involved with OceanGate, it was James Cameron. The director of Titanic had become one of the world's most recognizable deep-sea explorers after completing a series of groundbreaking dives. But despite OceanGate's growing profile, Cameron kept his distance. He reportedly turned down multiple invitations to dive with the company and never invested in it. That may have been the first warning. It wouldn't be the last. As development of Titan ramped up in 2019, Rush made a series of moves that gave the project a much stronger sense of credibility. The biggest was Titan's carbon fiber composite hull. It was an unconventional design that OceanGate believed could change deep-sea exploration. The company even held talks with NASA and contracted aerospace manufacturers to help build key parts. The project was still funded almost entirely by private investors who sank more than $18 million into its development. Suddenly, OceanGate looked like a serious project. The hull was the pride and joy of the Titan submersible, an experimental design that was supposed to allow it to withstand extreme pressure. This was a completely different design than James Cameron's Deep-Sea Challenger, which relied on a torpedo-shaped design and specialized buoyancy foam to survive the depths. To help develop Titan's technology, OceanGate also consulted with experts from the University of Washington and even aerospace giant Boeing. Except that may have all been a lie. By plastering those logos all over his design and marketing for a life-and-death operation, Rush created a false sense of security. People knew these names. They trusted that they wouldn't lend their expertise to anything that was doomed to fail. And they were right. They wouldn't. For the NASA connection, Rush took advantage of a program that allowed private businesses with an interest in deep-sea and space exploration to get access to certain facilities. NASA had no involvement in the design of the hull. And as for Boeing and the University of Washington, they issued statements after the disaster that they had no involvement at all. It was all a part of Rush's hustle, and it cost 5 people their lives. Because OceanGate wasn't actually an aerospace company, it was a shell game built on deceptive marketing, and the truth would only come out after the founder was dead. At the core of the OceanGate disaster was one critical problem. The material it was built out of was never going to work. Developing a submarine is incredibly difficult because the level of pressure it'll need to sustain is incredible. For those going to the same depths the Titanic sank to, they'll be experiencing pressure of 5,500 to 5,800 psi. That's like the weight of a pickup truck concentrated on the tiny area of a postage stamp. Would you bet your life on something withstanding that? Rush was, and he chose the worst of all possible materials to work with. Building submarines has never been easy. For more than a century, engineers have relied on metals because they're strong and, most importantly, they hold up under pressure. From the steel hulls of German U-boats to the specialized alloys used in modern U.S. Navy submarines, the formula has remained largely the same. Use materials that can survive repeated dives while showing obvious warning signs when something starts to go wrong. Rush wanted something different. He saw the Titan as not just a research vessel, but as a money-making opportunity. It was going to be a pleasure cruise for the wealthy. Customers would pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to take a ride down to the bottom of the ocean. If the test voyages worked out, Rush wanted to supercharge production and increase supply of these vessels, so costs had to be cut. The foam used by Deep Sea Challenger was incredibly expensive and difficult to construct. It consisted of an untold number of tiny glass spheres suspended in foam, requiring a level of precision that would take time and money to design. Rush wanted to get things moving, so he shifted to designing a new foam of carbon fiber reinforced polymer as the base of the submersible. This material was less expensive, but it was notoriously difficult to test for deep sea compression strength. And that was a huge risk, one that would not pay off. This would reduce the two most expensive components of construction from the process. He would use the syntactic foam for the outer buoyancy shell and the titanium common on submarines for the end domes. Additionally, there was an easy supply of carbon fiber, with aerospace companies working with it regularly. That meant Rush could buy it at a fraction of the price and get started experimenting with polymers immediately. If it worked, Rush would have created a system that was easy to duplicate and a model that other companies would soon copy. The sub would also be one of the lightest deep-sea submersibles ever built for a 5-person crew. That made it much easier to transport over long distances without specialized equipment. It was all part of Stockton Rush's unique worldview, which was often just summed up as "move fast and break things." He, like many tech industry upstarts, viewed himself as a disruptor who could figure out a way to do things better, faster, and cheaper. Rush told people that he could create a carbon fiber-based submarine that would put all the doubts to rest, that it would withstand the pressures of the ocean and allow Rush to bring the world of deep-sea exploration to the masses. But from the start, people were warning that he was wrong. Deadly wrong. Why wasn't carbon fiber used for building submarines before? Because it's just not a very good material for it. It is very strong when it comes to internal pressure, heat, and the forces of the sky and space. But when it comes to the extreme pressure of the deep sea, it's a different story. It might look strong up close, but it can hide a silent killer: delamination. This force slowly strips away the protective layers of the carbon fiber as it becomes more and more vulnerable. Under the best of circumstances, it would have been a risky choice for submarine design, but these weren't the best of circumstances. When the wreck of the Titan was eventually retrieved from the ocean, scientists were able to inspect it for its fatal flaws. What they found pointed to a long trail of negligence by Rush. There were imperfections in the hull dating back to the manufacturing process and repeated dives. The Titan spent long periods stored in Newfoundland through the harsh Atlantic Canadian winters. Critics later pointed to the lack of dedicated protection for the hull as another example of Rush's cost-conscious approach. There were other warning signs too. During a test dive roughly a year before the disaster, passengers reportedly heard a loud bang coming from the vessel, a sound that some experts would later interpret as a sign of damage inside the hull structure. By the time the Titan embarked on its last dive, there were growing concerns that the submersible had already endured stresses it was never meant to withstand. The material was wrong from the beginning, and Rush treated it like garbage. It's hard to believe no one saw this coming. Except they did, and they paid the price. Stockton Rush often styled himself as a one-man show at OceanGate, but you can't build a better submarine all by yourself, nor can you build a worse one apparently. Most people who started at the company fell by the wayside and were forced out by Rush. One of the most prominent was David Lochridge, a straight-talking Glaswegian with a deep background in deep-sea exploration and submersible design. He joined the company in 2015 and was brought in for his expertise for the Titan. From the very start, he noticed things were wrong. Lochridge had a background in the more practical side of ocean exploration, working with the Royal Navy piloting submarines, organizing rescue missions, and planning dives. His expertise initially pinpointed him as the person Rush wanted leading the effort. Lochridge was initially named Director of Marine Operations, and he took his job seriously. He would be piloting the ship, and that made him responsible for all the lives on board with him. If he saw something wrong, he was going to speak up. But that didn't mean that Rush would be listening. As the years wore on, Lochridge started to have his doubts about the project, and he demanded third-party oversight by an independent marine organization. After all, the entire construction was experimental. Eventually, OceanGate stopped working with the University of Washington's Applied Physics Laboratory long before the design was finished. It moved all its construction in-house. Lochridge didn't know if these scientists were up to the task, and he started asking more questions and expressing more doubts. That was the beginning of the end. He saw visible gaps in the carbon hull, clear evidence of delamination caused by manufacturing flaws. Lochridge even noticed that the titanium domes on the end of the hull hadn't been constructed correctly. The last straw was when Rush pulled the plug on the independent safety analysis Lochridge had demanded as part of his participation. The reason was to streamline the process and save money. Lochridge tried to bring up his issues, but he was met with resistance every step of the way, so he took action on his own. Lochridge knew that if the ship went ahead as is, it was doomed to complete failure. Rather than try to whistleblow to the public, he kept it internal, formulating a report that he sent out to all the company's directors, including Rush. It contained a detailed breakdown of the sub's safety issues, focusing on one of its key selling points: a real-time acoustic monitoring system designed to detect structural flaws or breaches as they happened. On paper, it sounded reassuring. In reality, it would only give a fraction of a second warning, milliseconds at best. At depth, that kind of alert isn't a warning at all. Lochridge got the attention of the higher-ups, but not the way he wanted. The next day, he was pulled into a meeting with a furious Stockton Rush and several other directors. Rush went on to rant about how he didn't intend to die, insisting that the submersible was one of the safest things he would ever do. Shortly after the meeting, Lochridge was abruptly fired. He was so troubled by what he had seen while working at OceanGate that he contacted OSHA with his concerns, hoping to trigger a government inspection that would slow the launch process. He got more than he was bargaining for. Lochridge successfully got OSHA to begin an investigation, and OceanGate struck back hard. After demanding that the complaint was withdrawn and the company's legal costs covered, they filed lawsuits against Lochridge and his wife for breach of contract, misappropriation of trade secrets, theft, and fraud. Lochridge filed for dismissal of the lawsuit, but OceanGate had deep pockets and the time and resources to push Lochridge into bankruptcy. After months of legal wrangling, Lochridge withdrew his OSHA complaint, giving Rush exactly what he wanted. The lawsuit was dead. Lochridge also signed a new non-disclosure agreement guaranteeing that he wouldn't tell anyone else what he had seen at OceanGate. Rush had successfully weaponized the legal system in his favor, and in doing so, he had signed his own death warrant. The Titan crew of 5 divers was an unusual group. Stockton Rush was a true believer in his concept, and he was willing to put his life on the line to prove it. He was joined by Hamish Harding, a British businessman with extensive financial ties to the United Arab Emirates, and Paul-Henri Nargeolet, a French Titanic expert and the only veteran deep-sea diver of the group. The last duo was Pakistani-British businessman Shahzada Dawood and his 19-year-old son Soleiman. According to the manifest of the mission, these were 5 mission specialists, each one given a position on the crew of the ship. This was despite some of them, especially the Dawoods, having zero experience in deep-sea exploration. But the reason for this wasn't qualifications, it was financial. Stockton Rush had made a lot of enemies in his quest to get to the Titanic, but if you asked him, his nemesis was probably bureaucracy. In the past, various sea disasters had led to the government passing the Passenger Vessel Safety Act of 1993, which held any ship designed to transport passengers to stricter standards. And Rush couldn't have that. He needed a loophole. OceanGate was technically a pay-per-ride service, but the price was a whopping $250,000. This was designed only for the wealthy, and at that point, you can make up your own rules. Rush thought the 1993 Act was an unnecessary hurdle for his plans, so he simply sidestepped it by adding the passengers to the crew, giving each of them a pro forma job that would allow him to bypass the extensive inspections that the government would have otherwise demanded. Rush knew OceanGate never would have passed them, and it was an act of arrogance, pure and simple. Ironically, Wendy Rush, OceanGate's communications director and married to Stockton Rush, has a personal link to the very vessel her husband was trying to visit. Her great-great-grandparents were Isidore and Ida Strauss, who both perished aboard the Titanic. Their wealth and status could have allowed them to get aboard a lifeboat, but Isidore refused until all the women and children were evacuated. Ida chose to stay by his side. They became 2 of the ship's most famous victims, and as a result of the same kind of arrogance. The Titanic changed seafaring forever, but the larger lessons weren't learned. Stockton Rush thought that regulations were obstacles, not warnings. He sought legal loopholes to ensure that he could speed up the process and cut costs. No one could tell him otherwise, especially after he fired Lochridge and successfully silenced him. When the Titan submersible imploded in the depths of the sea, the general reaction was that it was a black swan event, a freak implosion that no one could have seen coming. Most people mourned the loss of innocent lives. But behind the scenes, a different picture was forming. This wasn't a random disaster caused by a freak mechanical failure. It was a fully preventable disaster, and the warning signs were already there for years. Stockton Rush just wasn't listening. Before Titan set sail, Rush got submersible expert Karl Stanley to take a prototype out for a test dive. What happened scared Stanley away from the project and should have scuttled it for good. The 2019 voyage took place in the Bahamas, and it was aimed to simulate the depths of the Titanic mission, diving beyond 12,300 feet. But as they sank deeper, signs of trouble started emerging in the vessel, and it nearly claimed Stanley just like it claimed its later passengers. As soon as they reached high-pressure areas, Stanley reported hearing cracks and odd noises from the hull. They got louder the deeper they went. Rush had warned him about the noises, but only in the context that this was a thing to expect. According to him, it wasn't a sign of trouble. But Stanley, who was highly familiar with the makeup of submarines, correctly surmised that this might be a crack in the carbon fiber. And on the surface, the cracks were very visible, leading Stanley to try to alert Rush. A month later, the inspection of the prototype found cracks in the hull, and this prototype was dismantled with a new hull being designed. It would be the first of many dives, and they didn't have a great record. Of the 90 attempted dives prior to the fatal mission, only 13 successfully reached the depth of the Titanic. But they charged ahead, using a lower standard than would be expected. The metric of factor of safety is supposed to account for uncertainty. Structures are built to withstand far more pressure than they're expected to encounter in normal use. In many established systems, that buffer can be around 2.0 or higher. In Titan's case, that margin was reportedly narrowed during testing rather than expanded. In practical terms, it's like designing a bridge to hold 10 cars, and then only ever testing it with 9. It was not a sudden failure at all. Stockton Rush was planning to fail, even if he wouldn't admit it. A failure was inevitable, and on June 18, 2023, the ocean collected its due. The post-mortem investigation of the Titan disaster began almost immediately after the destruction of the vessel. The news was broadcast round the clock for days until the confirmation of the wreckage being found was aired. Over 2 years later, on August 5, 2025, the telemetry data was released to the public. It provided a grim account of the last minutes of Stockton Rush and his 4 unfortunate passengers. Stockton Rush believed in moving fast and breaking things, and he succeeded. But in this field, breaking things has fatal consequences. To get the Titan submersible in the water on schedule and ahead of budget, Rush cut every corner he could. He sidestepped safety measures and ignored the law. He found materials that promised a magical solution to the hard, slow process of creating foolproof submersibles. He got rid of every person who tried to talk him down from his plan of conquering the seas. He even used his own wallet and the force of the law to silence those who couldn't be easily bought off. But there was one opponent he couldn't pay off. Physics does not care who you are or how much money you have. Down there in the inky depths of the ocean, the cracking hull was the only judge of Rush's efforts that mattered. And just like the Titanic over 100 years prior, the icy depths of the Atlantic claimed rich and poor alike as the Titan submersible joined another, much larger ship in the depths. The most famous sunken ship of all time spelled Stockton Rush's doom. Now check out, why did the $100 million search for MH370 just end? For details on the shocking developments in the hunt for the most famous missing plane in history, or watch this video instead.